The year was 1859, and in the scorched, unforgiving wilderness of southern Arizona, a young Chiricahua Apache messenger named Klana B walked toward the McAllister ranch carrying a white-painted staff, his hands open and empty, his weapons left behind as tradition demanded. He came in peace, sent by his elders to negotiate a truce that might end the raids and killings that had plagued the territory for years. What happened in the next 60 seconds would ignite a blood war so brutal, so relentless, that it would consume 24 years, claim 73 lives, and transform the Dragoon Mountains into a graveyard where neither side could claim victory. Only loss, only death, only the bitter taste of revenge that never satisfies. This is the story of the Chiricahua Apache versus the McAllister family, where a broken truce became a sacred obligation for vengeance, where honor demanded blood payment across generations, and where the violation of a single spiritual law turned neighbors into mortal enemies who would hunt each other like animals until nothing remained but bones and memories. Before we descend into this nightmare of betrayal and retribution, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We're genuinely curious to know where our audience is located around the world, and your engagement helps us tremendously as we work toward our goal of reaching 1,000 subscribers. To understand how a moment of paranoia could spawn 2 decades of slaughter, you need to understand the Arizona territory of the 1850s. This was a land caught between 2 worlds, neither of which showed mercy to those caught in the middle. The Chiricahua Apache had inhabited these mountains and deserts for centuries, moving between the Sierra Madre of Mexico and the peaks of Arizona with the seasons, following game and water, living according to laws older than any map drawn by white men. They were the most feared Apache group, masters of guerrilla warfare who could disappear into landscapes that would kill unprepared settlers within days. Their warriors could cover 50 miles on foot in a single night, strike without warning at dawn, and vanish before their enemies even understood they were under attack. The Chiricahua didn't just fight. They made war an art form, a spiritual practice where courage and cunning were virtues taught from childhood. But the white settlers flooding into Arizona after the Mexican-American War saw only savages standing between them and the mineral wealth buried in these mountains. The McAllister family represented this new order, Confederate veterans who had fled the destroyed South after the Civil War and claimed land they believed was theirs by right of superior civilization. Elias McAllister, the patriarch, had been a cavalry officer who brought military discipline and frontier ruthlessness to building his ranch in the shadow of the Dragoon Mountains. He hired armed men, fortified his property, and made it clear to neighboring Apache bands that he would defend what he considered his, with lethal force if necessary. The tension between the Chiricahua and the settlers had been building for years, a slow accumulation of grievances on both sides. Apache raided ranches for horses and cattle because the settlers had destroyed their traditional hunting grounds. Settlers organized militias that attacked Apache camps, often killing women and children because they couldn't catch the warriors. Each side viewed the other as irredeemable enemies, subhuman threats that needed to be eliminated. But there were still those who hoped for peace, Apache elders who recognized that the tide of white settlement couldn't be stopped, and believed negotiation was better than extinction. In the spring of 1859, these elders made a decision that would haunt them forever. They sent young Klana B, a nephew of the respected war leader Nache, to the McAllister ranch with a proposal. The Chiricahua would cease their raids on McAllister property and encourage other Apache bands to do the same. In exchange, the McAllister family would stop supporting the territorial militias that were hunting Apache families like animals. It was a simple offer, a chance for both sides to step back from the edge of total war. Klana B carried the white-painted staff that symbolized sacred truce in Apache culture, a symbol so powerful that harming a messenger bearing it was considered a spiritual crime that demanded divine punishment. Thomas McAllister Jr., Elias's oldest son and heir to the ranch, saw Klana B approaching from the main house window. Thomas was 23 years old, hardened by frontier life, suspicious of every Apache after losing friends to raids, and absolutely convinced that any offer of peace was a trick designed to lower their defenses before an attack. He grabbed his rifle, ignored his mother Martha's pleas to at least hear what the messenger wanted, and walked onto the porch. Clanah B raised the white staff, spoke the ritual words of greeting in broken English, and began to explain his mission. Thomas interrupted him mid-sentence, raised his rifle, and shot the young Apache through the chest. Clanah B fell backward into the dust, blood spreading across his ceremonial shirt, his eyes wide with shock and betrayal. He died within minutes, still clutching the white staff that should have protected him. Thomas walked down from the porch, stood over the body, and to compound the horror beyond imagination, ordered his ranch hands to display Clanah B's corpse on a fence post as a warning to any other Apache who might approach. The message was clear. The McAllisters recognized no truce, honored no traditions, and viewed every Apache as an enemy to be killed on sight. When word reached the Chiricahua bands camped in the mountains above, the reaction was immediate and absolute. Nache, who had sent his own nephew on this mission of peace, didn't weep or rage. He simply began sharpening his weapons with the calm focus of a man who knows exactly what must be done. For the Apache, what Thomas McAllister had done wasn't just murder. It was a violation of spiritual law so profound that it created an obligation that transcended personal choice. The white staff meant divine protection. Killing a messenger carrying it was an act that poisoned the land itself, that brought curse upon the killer and everyone who stood with him. Revenge wasn't optional or emotional. It was a sacred duty that had to be fulfilled to restore cosmic balance. Nache called together the War Council and spoke words that would define the next 2 decades. The McAllister family and everyone who supported them were now enemies of the Chiricahua people, and this state of war would continue until balance was restored through blood. There would be no negotiation, no mercy, no possibility of peace, until the spiritual debt was paid in full. The first Apache strike came just 3 weeks after Clanah B's murder. In the darkest hours before dawn, when the ranch hands were sleeping and only one exhausted guard watched the main gate, Chiricahua warriors led by Nache and the master tracker Bichkande infiltrated the McAllister property. They didn't attack the main house where the family slept. That would come later. Instead, they burned the stables to the ground, releasing the horses and cattle that represented the ranch's wealth, and killing 2 ranch hands who tried to fight the flames. By the time Elias and Thomas rallied their men and grabbed weapons, the Apache had vanished into the pre-dawn darkness, as if they had never been there at all. The message was unmistakable. We can reach you whenever we want. We can destroy what you value, and you cannot stop us. If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of history's most brutal feuds, we'd really appreciate it if you'd hit that subscribe button right now. We're working hard to reach 1,000 subscribers, and every single subscription helps us continue bringing you these incredible untold stories. Your support means everything to our channel. Elias McAllister understood immediately that this was no ordinary raid. This was the beginning of a war that wouldn't end until one side was destroyed. He responded the only way frontier logic allowed, with overwhelming retaliation designed to break Apache will through sheer brutality. Within a week, McAllister hired guns, tracked 3 young Chiricahua men who were harvesting agave in the foothills, completely unaware that they were now targets in a conflict they knew nothing about. The hired killers shot all 3 in the back and left their bodies to rot in the sun. When the Apache found them, Nache knew that Thomas's crime had metastasized into something larger. The McAllisters weren't just defending themselves, they were declaring war on the entire Chiricahua people. The conflict escalated with terrifying speed. Apache warriors ambushed a supply caravan that McAllister had hired to bring goods from Tucson, killing the teamsters and burning the wagons. McAllister responded by organizing neighboring ranchers into what they called the Dragoon Militia, a private army designed to hunt Apache wherever they could be found. The militia rode into the mountains and attacked an Apache camp, killing 2 women before realizing they had struck the wrong band entirely. These Apache had nothing to do with the feud, but now they did. The violence spread like poison through water, contaminating everyone it touched, dragging in families and bands who had wanted nothing to do with the original conflict. By 1863, the war had become hereditary. Children on both sides grew up hearing stories of murdered relatives, learning hatred with their first words, raised to understand that the enemy was irredeemable and deserved only death. Chiricahua children learned the names McAllister and Dragoon Militia, the way other children learned about monsters in bedtime stories. McAllister children were taught to shoot before they learned to read, trained to sleep with weapons close, warned never to trust any Apache under any circumstances. The war created its own culture, its own rituals, its own terrible logic that made perfect sense to those trapped inside it and looked like insanity to everyone outside. The Chiricahua, led by Nache and the brilliant strategist Taliko, a woman whose tactical genius made her feared throughout the territory, began using the Sierra Madre Mountains as a base for extended campaigns. They would strike in Arizona, then disappear into Mexico, where American militias couldn't legally follow. They perfected hit-and-run tactics that left settlers terrified and helpless, never knowing when or where the next attack would come. The years between 1864 and 1879 became known among Arizona settlers as the Blood Decade, a period when the Chiricahua-McAllister feud consumed the entire region in violence that seemed to have no end. The Apache stopped targeting only the McAllister family. They attacked anyone who provided supplies, labor, or support to the ranch. Merchants who sold goods to McAllister found their stores burned. Ranch hands who worked McAllister land were ambushed on their way home. The militia retaliated by attacking any Apache they encountered, regardless of involvement in the feud. In 1870, militia members made a catastrophic mistake that transformed the conflict from vendetta into total war. They attacked what they thought was a Chiricahua war camp, but was actually a peaceful gathering where Apache women were preparing food for winter. The militia killed 4 women before realizing their error, and by then it was too late to matter. The Apache response was immediate and merciless. They began burning McAllister pasture lands, poisoning water sources, and ambushing ranch hands in terrain where the settlers' numbers meant nothing against Apache knowledge of the land. The McAllister family, watching their empire crumble under relentless Apache pressure, made increasingly desperate decisions. Elias hired professional gunfighters from Tombstone and Prescott, men who killed for money rather than principle. But even these hardened killers struggled against warriors who had been training for combat since childhood. Thomas Jr., now the de facto leader after his father's health began failing from stress and age, organized larger and larger militia expeditions into the mountains, but the Apache simply melted away before superior numbers and struck when the exhausted settlers were strung out and vulnerable. The Chiricahua developed tactics specifically designed to counter settler advantages. They used fire to drive cattle and horses into canyons where they would starve or fall to their deaths. They contaminated water sources that settlers depended on, forcing them to abandon strategic positions. They attacked at night when visibility favored those who knew the terrain, and they used the echo properties of narrow canyons to make a few warriors sound like many, creating panic among militia members who imagined themselves surrounded by overwhelming forces. By 1880, the body count had reached horrifying proportions. At least 73 people had died directly from the feud. Apache warriors, settlers, ranch hands, merchants, and even children caught in crossfire or killed in retaliatory raids. Entire families on both sides had been wiped out, their names surviving only in cemetery records that marked death dates spanning years. The McAllister Ranch, once prosperous, was operating at a fraction of its capacity because no one wanted to risk working there. The Chiricahua had suffered losses too. Young warriors killed in attacks, elders who died from stress and grief, families scattered across the Sierra Madre, living as refugees from their own homeland. Both sides were exhausted, bleeding, sustained only by the momentum of hatred and the belief that stopping would dishonor everyone who had already died. The question wasn't whether the feud would end. It was whether anyone would survive to see its conclusion. The final chapter began in 1883, when Nache, now an old man whose entire adult life had been defined by this war, conceived a plan that would either end the conflict or destroy what remained of his people. The Apache had learned that Thomas McAllister Jr. was organizing one final massive militia expedition designed to track the Chiricahua to their Sierra Madre strongholds and exterminate them once and for all. Thomas had grown into a man consumed by the feud, unable to see any future that didn't involve Apache destruction, willing to spend everything the family had left on this final campaign. Nache decided to give Thomas exactly what he wanted, a decisive battle, but on Apache terms, in Apache territory, where superior numbers meant nothing against perfect knowledge of terrain. Working with Bichconde and Talico, Nache identified a narrow canyon in the Dragoon Mountains that the settlers called Ghost Canyon, though the Apache knew it by a different name that translated roughly as "where echoes lie." The canyon had perfect acoustic properties that made it impossible to determine the true location of sounds, loose rock formations that could be triggered to create avalanches, and only two viable entrances that could be easily defended or blocked. The Apache began a calculated campaign of raids specifically designed to enrage Thomas McAllister and draw him into pursuing them. They burned outlying buildings, ran off livestock, and left signs that clearly indicated they were moving toward the Dragoon Mountains. Thomas, exactly as predicted, assembled his militia, over 40 armed men representing the largest settler force the territory had seen, and pursued the Apache into the mountains. Nache and his warriors, numbering barely 15 but operating on home ground with absolute tactical advantage, led the militia deeper and deeper into the wilderness, always staying just ahead, always visible enough to keep the pursuit going. On a scorching afternoon in late summer, the militia entered Ghost Canyon, following Apache tracks that led them into the narrowing passage between towering rock walls. Thomas McAllister rode at the front, rifle ready, convinced that he was finally going to corner the Apache, who had haunted his entire life. What he didn't know was that Chiricahua warriors were positioned on both canyon walls, behind rock formations, completely invisible from below, waiting for the signal to spring the trap. Nache, watching from above, raised his hand and brought it down in a gesture that unleashed carefully orchestrated chaos. Apache warriors loosed fire arrows that ignited brush the militia needed to pass through, creating walls of flame that separated the settlers from each other. Other warriors triggered rock slides that blocked both canyon exits, trapping the militia in a killing ground with nowhere to run. The Chiricahua didn't charge down to engage in hand-to-hand combat. They fought Apache style, using the terrain itself as a weapon, firing from concealed positions, using the canyon's echo to make it impossible for the militia to coordinate a response. The battle lasted less than an hour but felt eternal to those trapped inside. Men fired at shadows and echoes, wasted ammunition on empty air, panicked and shot at their own comrades in the smoke and confusion. Thomas McAllister Jr., trying desperately to rally his men and organize a defense, took an arrow through the throat and fell from his horse, drowning in his own blood while his father watched helplessly. Elias McAllister, the old Confederate officer who had started this journey decades ago by claiming land he believed was his by right, died trying to reach his son's body, shot multiple times by warriors he never saw. By the time the smoke cleared and the Apache melted back into the mountains, over 20 militia members lay dead or dying in Ghost Canyon. The survivors fled in complete disorder, abandoning weapons and supplies, concerned only with escaping the nightmare they had walked into. The Battle of Ghost Canyon broke the McAllister family's power forever. With both Elias and Thomas dead, the ranch had no leadership and no future. The remaining family members, primarily women who had opposed the feud from the beginning, including Martha McAllister, who had begged her son not to pursue this final campaign, sold what remained of the property and left Arizona, unable to remain in a place that held nothing but graves and bitter memories. The Chiricahua, for their part, considered the spiritual debt paid. Klana B's death had been answered with the deaths of those most responsible. The white staff had been avenged through blood, and cosmic balance had been restored at terrible cost. Nache, who had dedicated his entire adult life to this war, lived only 2 more years before dying quietly in the Sierra Madre, his purpose fulfilled and his energy exhausted. The younger warriors, who had known nothing but conflict, had to learn how to live in peace, a skill their fathers had never taught them because their fathers had never known peace themselves. Today, the legacy of the Chiricahua McAllister feud exists in fragments scattered across southern Arizona. The McAllister Ranch is long gone, reclaimed by desert and time, marked only by foundation stones that few visitors recognize or understand. Ghost Canyon is still there, still echoing with sounds that might be wind or might be something older, avoided by locals who know the stories even if they don't entirely believe them. Among the Chiricahua descendants, there exists a song called The Betrayed Messenger, sung during certain ceremonies, a reminder of what happens when sacred laws are violated and when pride becomes more important than survival. The settlers who remained in Arizona after the feud learned painful lessons about the cost of dishonoring traditions they didn't understand, about the price of paranoia and prejudice, about how easily violence becomes self-sustaining once it begins. The feud claimed 73 confirmed lives over 24 years, destroyed 2 prominent families, and poisoned an entire region with fear and hatred that took generations to dissipate. What makes this blood war particularly tragic is how completely unnecessary it was. 1 moment of patience, 1 second of restraint, 1 choice to listen instead of shoot, and Klana B would have delivered his message. Negotiations would have begun, and perhaps peace could have taken root. Instead, Thomas McAllister Jr.'s paranoia and cultural ignorance triggered a cycle of revenge that consumed everything both sides valued, leaving only loss and regret. The Chiricahua fought because their spiritual laws demanded it. Failing to avenge the murdered messenger would have been a betrayal of everything their culture held sacred. The McAllister family fought because frontier logic taught them that showing weakness meant death, that negotiating with savages was impossible, that only force could secure their future. Both sides were trapped by their own cultural assumptions, unable to see paths to peace that might have existed if anyone had possessed the courage to break the cycle. The story of the Chiricahua Apache versus the McAllister family stands as a stark reminder that revenge is a poison that kills everyone who touches it, that cultural misunderstanding can escalate into genocide, that honor codes designed to maintain order can become engines of destruction when applied rigidly in changing circumstances. 24 years of blood, 73 dead, countless more wounded or traumatized, 2 families destroyed, and in the end, neither side won anything worth the cost. The Apache preserved their honor, but lost warriors they could not afford to lose in a time when their entire way of life was disappearing. The McAllisters defended their property, but lost their family, their future, and ultimately the land itself. The only victor was death, which feasted on pride and fear until nothing remained but bones bleaching in the Arizona sun, and stories whispered around fires about the price of broken truces. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Share this video, leave a comment, and join us as we continue exploring the untold stories of conflict and consequence that shaped the American frontier. Because history isn't just dates and battles. It's the moment when everything goes wrong, and we have to live with the consequences of choices made in anger and fear.